Every mistake I've ever made was because I believed what I was told and the dominant narrative without actually looking into it. They decided to make stuff up, and it started getting more and more bizarre, like meaning disconnected from your actual experience. You know, the process of logic, rational thinking, and I would say science is to find out what the claim is and see if that's true. There has never been a virology experiment.
But then the idea about the sun, the core of the sun's actually only 5,000 degrees C, so it's actually cold. So how can it be a giant nuclear sort of reactor?
Well,
And that started me beginning to sort of question everything.
I don't believe in diseases, but there is one disease. It has a variant too. It's called a physician-acquired thought disorder.
When your material body no longer is here, what do you think happens next to the sort of conscious essence of Dr. Tom Cowan? Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah, and today my guest is Dr. Tom Cowan because I did his training course and it took me quite a long time to digest the information in the course. Tom's also written several books, and in this interview today, we talk about a variety of things from atoms to disease to happiness. And what I really liked about this when I talked to Tom is it's about questioning the mainstream narrative, which is something that I think is so important. So I'll hand you over to Tom now. Welcome to the channel, Dr. Tom Cowan. Thank you very much for being on.
Thank you, Sarah. Good to see you.
Yeah, so for people who don't know you, do you want to tell people a bit about who you are and your background?
Well, I was trained starting 1980. That's actually after I was a Peace Corps volunteer teaching gardening in Swaziland, Africa for 2 years. And then I went to medical school, and then I did a family practice training, although I didn't finish it actually. And then I was a doctor for 37-ish years, and all the time looking into what's real in medicine and science and what isn't. And I found most things are not real, and that has a big effect on how we do medicine. And so I wrote books about that. And then I basically quit doing medicine because I couldn't really be part of that anymore. And then I've been going down more of these rabbit holes than before. And I like to say that every mistake I've ever made was because I believed what I was told and the dominant narrative without actually looking into it. And there was a lot of those mistakes, even though I'm very aware of that this probably doesn't sound right, but you know, it's hard to look into everything.
Oh no, I completely agree because when we were talking off camera, I wanted to go into the realms of how 0.0001% of the universe is actually matter and the rest is plasma or ether or whatever you want to call it. So that's a fundamental problem. And then we've talked about this before, but also this idea about we're too obsessed with what's dissolved in the fluids in the body and how the water, which is the bulk of a human, excluding what I was just talking about, and how there's too much focus on things like say, I've heard you talk about neurotransmitters being too slow, about creating artifacts in the fluid. So it's sort of the idea that the bath water is something really important to look at, and we focus just on the baby. So do you want to maybe take it from there and sort of describe to people how mistruths in science have sort of led me to ask you these kind of questions?
Yeah, well, they don't have to understand anything, but if they want to understand where we're at as a culture and particularly so-called science and medicine, um, and it goes way back, and I'm not like a historian of science by any means, but you could start somewhere around 1850s, and then it really came to a peak in the early 1900s, where the sort of nature of reality started to change. But let me qualify that. The nature of reality didn't change. What changed was in the minds of the physicists and scientists. And they got to the point, and I think it's really best summarized by a quote from a guy named Albert Einstein, which everybody's heard of, and everybody considers him like the smartest person who ever lived. And he was Time Magazine's Man of the Century for changing the way we think. And this is a paraphrase, not a quote, but he said, no longer should science be based on observation and experiments, but should be free inventions of the mind. Now, that's a very interesting thing, because you could change the word free inventions of the mind to making shit up. And so that's what they did. They decided to make stuff up, and it started getting more and more bizarre, like meaning disconnected from your actual experience. So they said, well, two things are in the same place. Two things are in different places at the same time, like your cat, right? Or your house, right? It's at two different places. Like my house is not in two different places at the same time. I can guarantee that. But they say, well, yeah, but it's only when it's really small or really big, then it's at two places. So my question would be, at what point of smallness, like my house isn't at two places at the same time, a frog isn't, like a piece of pencil isn't, as far as I know, bacteria aren't. So at what point of size does it suddenly shift, and now all of a sudden it's at two places at the same time? Of course, they can't answer that question. And so then you find the next thing in science is, because I would say people could dispute this, but I would say every free invention of the mind turns out to be wrong, because the person who did that free invention is not God and is not omniscient, and they miss things, right? So even as smart as they are, they get things wrong. And then science has a fork in the road. So you can either admit that the original premise or hypothesis was wrong, or you can make something up to keep the story going. So let me give you an example. One of the things that I've spoken about a lot, they said that there's these submicroscopic particles called viruses, which you can't see, nobody has an experience of. At the time they said this, nobody had any experience of this at all, right? There's no observation, no data, no experiment that showed it. And they said, everybody who encounters somebody who has the virus will get sick, right? So if you have chicken pox, then everybody that you encounter who will also get chicken pox. Well, that's not true, right? Some people get it, seemingly, and most people don't. So you've actually falsified that claim, right? That claim is not true. So you could either say, well, there's something wrong with that hypothesis, that theory, that this person has a quote virus and it makes everybody sick. Or you can say, well, that's because people have an immune system, and so they don't get sick because they're immune to the virus. And so that's now that claim stands for another 20, 30 years, right? Until people say, so what is the immune system based on? It's based on antibodies, right? So you get chickenpox virus, then you get antibodies. And for sure, antibodies mean you're immune to the virus, right? That was the next claim. So then they say, see, people have chickenpox, they have antibodies, and then they don't get chickenpox again. And people have the flu and they have antibodies, but they get the flu again. but that's because the flu mutates and changes. So we put another layer of the story on, right? And then we get to HIV, and then they test for antibodies, and they say, oh, now if you have antibodies, that means the virus is going to kill you. You say, wait a minute. I remember when I heard that, and I thought, wait a minute. You just told me that if I have antibodies, I'm immune. And now you're telling me if I have antibodies, I'm going to die. Like, that doesn't make any sense. Anyways, at the end of it, it's like W.C. Fields said, if you can't dazzle them with brilliance, baffle them with bullshit. So that's what this is about. So when you say 99.9% is plasma or ether or the electromagnetic field, and 0.01% or so is substance, I'm not even sure there is substance. They have this experiment where everybody believes it. They say, we now know that that stuff, like physics, that stuff in the world can exist simultaneously as a particle and a wave. I mean, I'd love to see the experiment that proves that. I know they have an experiment called the slit lamp experiment, but if you read it, it doesn't actually prove that that's true. So they essentially get you to believe stuff that you don't know where they got it from, and you just think, well, they can't all be wrong, right? Because they're smart people and they're doctors and they get a lot of money and they're on the TV all the time. So they must be right. And I don't know, so I must not know anything about this. And what happens then is people are disconnected from their life, right? So they're believers in stuff that actually doesn't make any sense to them, but you got to believe it or you get gaslit and ostracized and fired and humiliated and shamed. You don't believe there's such a thing as a virus, even though you have no idea how anybody came up with that. That is a very vulnerable place to be. And that's where the world is now. And that was a long answer to that question, but it's one way to answer it.
Oh no, it's fine because I couldn't get my head around the wave particle duality, but then it must be just a wave based on sort of analyzing things in a different way and thinking about it. But also, I think there's worse than just being laughed at and ridiculed and cancelled because there's people like Wilhelm Reich, who was a genius, Albert St. Georgi, all of these people who try to go against the paradigm. They either get put in prison or they don't get funding. So there's another fundamentally big problem in science is what might actually be useful. They aren't allowed to study it.
Right. I mean, there's another great example. We all end up believing in what's called the nuclear atom, right? That means that stuff, it's like billiard balls. Our stuff is made of atoms. That's a fundamental unit. And the atom has a nucleus, which has a proton, which is positive charge, and a neutron, which is neutral charge. And then it's got electrons spinning around, connected to the protons, spinning around the atom. Now, everybody believes that. It's the basis of the theory of matter, that thing you're talking about, the 0.1%. And then you say to people, okay, what was the experiment that demonstrated that there is a nuclear atom? Do you know?
No, but then I have had the advantage of reading the book The Case Against the Atom, which took me about
Right.
a month to even get past the first couple of pages, and there isn't one.
No, actually there is. It's Rutherford's experiment. He shot they took a thin layer of metal and they shot a beam of light through it, and 99.9% of the light beams went through unimpeded, and 0.1% or less, there was a scatter of the light. And they said, well, that's the nucleus. So all the mass, all the substance is in the nucleus. Now, there are other explanations for that, one of which is
Yeah.
the whole part is the atom. That's one. Another is there's impurities in that metal. right? So that's why there's gets scatter in some places and not in others. But there's another experiment too that they said when there's radioactive decay, there's three things that come out. I think they're gamma rays and helium neutron or nuclei and electrons. And they said, well, the electrons come out of the atom, so they must have been in the atom before the decay. But the other two, they come out of the decay as well, but they're not they were not in the atom. They were produced by the radioactive process. And there, that doesn't make, like, if that's the proof that it came out, then why aren't all three part of the original atom? Why only one? And so there's no answer. So then they start making stuff up. But one of the things I want to point out, so everybody believes in that model, except if you go to Erwin Schrödinger, one of the fathers of nuclear physics, and say, what do you think about an electron? He'd say, oh, if you looked, and this is a quote, if you looked into an atom, you would never see an electron. It's simply a probability mathematical concept. In other words, it's the free invention of somebody's mind. It doesn't actually exist. Now, you could say, well, what's Tom? Like, what difference does any of this make, right? There's a nucleus or a neutron or, electrons or whatever. Well, one thing is if there's no nucleus, then you know, there's no nuclear weapons because that's based on the fact that there's a nucleus which you can split, and out of this tiny little thing, and we're talking really tiny, you get an explosion that will kill the world. I mean, that's a stretch, right? Because usually things that small don't destroy the world, like they're not that powerful. Anyways, it is. So then even though nobody can demonstrate that this fission-based process actually exists because the nucleus doesn't exist. And so then that's a huge deal because now we have the whole world is terrified and there's trillions and trillions of dollars spent on these so-called nuclear weapons, which, by the way, have never been used coincidentally since the Hiroshima Nagasaki thing, which is a whole nother subject in itself. Uh, and that's just a weird coincidence. Like no bad guy has ever used them or whatever, even though you can find the plans right on the internet, supposedly. So, there's just a lot of things that just don't make sense.
Oh no, I know. Like David Bohm said, that there's no uncertainty principle. We just don't know enough. And I think that
Yeah,
kind of
right.
sums it up.
Okay. Yeah, so the uncertainty principle, you can't know the location and the velocity of an object of an electron at the same time. And so then you think you can't know the speed and the location of a thing at the same time. But cops do it all the time. You're going 60 miles an hour in a 40-mile-an-hour zone right over there. So they know the location and the velocity. So they say, yeah, well, that's because that's the normal scale. On the quantum scale, the little tiny scale, then it doesn't work anymore, right? Somehow you get smaller and smaller and smaller, and all the rules flip. That's nonsense. Because I'd love to ask them, at what size, like a frog, is that when the rules flip? Or a mosquito or a bacteria? Because as far as we can tell, the rules are the same with those. And then they have the audacity to say, the way the world really works is absurd, incomprehensible, and not logical. Like, thank you very much. So why are we studying this? No, but you have to understand the whole thing is illogical and absurd. That's the world you live in. Thanks for coming. I don't know. I don't buy it.
Oh no, I mean, I'm not sure what you think about this, but then because I've been looking into physics and I don't for 1 minute pretend I even understand any of it, especially quantum physics, because sometimes people don't understand something because it's not right. But then the idea about the sun, the core of the sun's actually only 5,000 degrees C, so it's actually cold. So how can it be a giant nuclear sort of reactor? And that started me beginning to sort of question everything. And when
Yeah,
you
they
sometimes have to go back to the beginning, I've got no idea how the sun works. I know it's really important to go out in it, and I know heat comes off, and I know different wavelengths of light, and there's obviously solar flares, then will be the plasma, which I'm just starting to learn about. But what's your thoughts on that?
yeah, I mean it's complicated, but I think what most important, and if there's anything that these days I try to communicate to people is, the process of logic, rational thinking, and I would say science is to find out what the claim is and see if that's true. In other words, and if something is not falsifiable, then it's not science, it's a belief. Now, I have nothing against believing stuff. We all do it. But one should have a very clear line between I believe stuff or I know it to be true that has a logical, rational, experimental, confirmed basis. And stick to what the claim is and don't worry about what is true. Like I don't know what the sun is. Uh, but I know that what they say it is not the case. And there's a great example of this of how this works, which is which I got from a friend of mine. Imagine you're 18 and you're Asian looking and your parents are Caucasian, right? And then one day you're rummaging in your parents' closet and you find adoption papers. And you go to your mother and say, "Is this true? You never told me I was adopted. I always wondered because it didn't look like you, but you never said anything." And she says, "Yeah, we didn't want to tell you we were waiting, and we got you from an orphanage in China, and we didn't want to tell you to traumatize you, etc." So it's very clear. There's no pictures of her pregnant. Everything is very clear. And so then you go, just found out I was adopted. And he says, "So who are your real parents?" "I don't know, some or I don't know who my parents are. I may never know." Um, and then he says to you, "Well, until you tell me who your real parents are, I don't believe you were adopted." That is the essence of anti-scientific thinking because it has nothing to do with it, right? The one is a specific claim which you can verify or not. If you can't verify it or falsify it, it's not a scientific claim. And that's why when you ask people, you're in conversation, people say, whatever claim they're making, find the claim and ask them for how this claim was verified. They tell you there's a virus, say, "How do you know that? Show me the paper that verifies it." And most 99% of the people say, "I have no idea," which means it's a belief system. You still there?
Oh yes, yes, I'm just listening.
Yeah.
Because that's the thing. It's one of these things. It's like nothing is true, everything is possible. And like you were saying, you don't know what the sun is. I have my own sort of ways of getting around this. That, like you said, very importantly, right at the beginning, experience, personal experience of being ill or not ill, and people who adopt certain behaviors and thought patterns and source their food properly and go outside and drink clean water tend not to get bothered by these things that we call microorganisms. I'm with bacteria. That's one thing that I believe in, but then with the other things, it's sometimes it's very hard to show me something. The problem is I did used to work in a lab, and I don't mind what you say about this. And we used to get bacteriophage problems when we were doing recombinant work with bacteria to make protein. And then we'd take it down to the electron microscopy. And I used to do electron microscopy as well. So I know you dry things, stain things, put them epoxide resin, chop them up. And all the time we kept seeing these electron micrographs of these things that look like lunar landing modules or hexagons or whatever. So it was like, oh, these are the phage. But then since thinking about it, it's like it's back to this thing I was going to ask you again about water, is that did we just make artifacts in the water and call it phage lander or phage T4 phage or whatever, because it's all about, okay, there is something there, but then did we make it by accident? And then humans always want to name things. So that's my only sort of personal experience with seeing a virus firsthand. So supposedly, because I know electron microscopy is the worst technique for making artifacts.
So number one, a phage is not a virus. It's not the same definition. And that's in one of the problems of modern science is, it's just like isolation. Isolation means separating one thing from all other things. So they call isolation the mixing of things together, which is nonsense. So number one. Number two, every picture in an electron microscope is an artifact. Every one. And it's an uncontrolled artifact because you don't know what that thing looks like if you didn't do those steps, right? And, a guy named Harold Hillman talked about this in great length. Now, just because you can repeat the process, so you can stress bacteria and they break down, and then you stain it in certain ways, and then you get these forms, right? With a certain kind of process. So all that means is if you do those things over and over again, you'll get the same forms. I mean, stop the presses. That's so that doesn't mean that thing was there in the bacteria. And second of all, the definition of a virus is it has, a replication competent entity or particle that has a certain coding and has certain, genetic material and is able to replicate in hosts and cause disease. That phage, if it even exists, is a breakdown product of bacteria. That has nothing to do with any definition of a virus, except in the only thing that's similar, which is interesting, is it's supposedly the same size, right? So it's the same kind of size and as a virus, which proves that if there was such a thing as a virus, and you could see it in an electron microscope, you should be able to do that because you can see things of similar size. And the fact that you can't means it's another step in the process of, or the argument, that there is no such thing as a virus. Now, there are bacteria, right? You can see them and you can work with them and they can make things. The issue we're talking about, or I'm talking about, and these are very simple proofs or very simple questions. Do bacteria cause disease? Now, the way to sort that out is to do an experiment because you can't figure that out by looking at it, right? You can't smell it. You can't see that happen. You don't have an observation. So you would do a very simple thing, take the bacteria and only the bacteria, prove that that's all you have, and expose people or animals in the normal way to only that bacteria and show that it causes a certain disease, right? That's how you would do it. If you have that study, I'll be happy to say that that's how it works. But I can guarantee you there is no such study.
Yeah, what you kind of touched on two really interesting things, because first of all, there's Luke Montagnier's paper in 2009, and then he rewrote it in, I think, in 2015, talking about when you get an infectious bacteria, you can spin it, you can isolate the supernatant, filter it through a sort of 100 micron filter. So there has to be no bacteria left in the supernatant. It's just a trace. Then they diluted it down, and then they found that this particular supernatant that had no trace of the so-called bacteria in it was able to create a response, but they were measuring antibodies at the end. And then this is why I wanted to talk to you about all of this, because sometimes there's a really good study, because the point of that study wasn't about
So
whether bacteria.
Montagnier is a clear fool. Sorry to be blunt, but you can go back to his whole HIV nonsense. The guy got basically everything wrong. Now, and so why don't they just do what I said? Very simple. If they think that this supernatant causes disease, why don't they do that, not look for antibodies? Why use indirect measurements that the antibodies are not specific for a disease? You know, you can even go back to AIDS. They said, and he said, antibodies specific for HIV. Well, now we know there's 66 other conditions where you get so-called HIV antibodies. So he was wrong. He said reverse transcriptase is the signature of, retroviruses. It only will happen if there's a retrovirus. That's what Montagnier said. Turns out it happens in every cell culture there is, especially if you stress it with certain chemicals. So he was clearly wrong, and I would say deceiving people, because he knew that, for instance, reverse transcriptase, this enzyme which converts RNA into DNA, which he said if that's present, that means there was a retrovirus in the sample. Clear as a bell, he said that. He knew that was a lie. Gallo himself did a paper 10 years before that showing reverse transcriptase in every culture of lymphocytes that they did with Montagnier's technique. He knew that was a lie. So, I'm going to have to see any paper from Luke Montagnier before I believe a word of it.
I suppose that the 2009 one was more about how having an electric field present recreated structures in the water in the complete absence of the original bacterium. But that was his later work, because I know what you're referring to, that didn't he change fields once he'd got his recognition? He then started to study water, but he didn't ever say, oh, actually, maybe I was wrong. He didn't, like you were saying, sometimes people don't admit they were wrong and they just leave the nonsense, and rather than dispelling it, because people don't like to retract a paper.
He not only never admitted he was wrong, he continued to insist that he was correct, and as far as I know, until he died, and continued to promote the viral nonsense until he died, even though, there was a paper that he absolutely knew about from Gelderblum, where they say if you have a virus like HIV allegedly is, then that has to have different proteins than the host. Otherwise, it's not an independent entity. You know what I mean by that, right? So you take T lymphocyte of a so-called HIV infected person. This is Hans Gelderblum paper. Montagnier absolutely knew about this. So he says, okay, this HIV positive, there's viruses infecting the T lymphocytes. He grinds it up, spins it down, does electrophoresis. I think the number was 28 separate proteins, right, in this infected T lymphocyte. And then he does the same thing with a non-infected T lymphocyte, right? No possibility for HIV. Guess what? Gets the exact same number of proteins, proving that there are no HIV proteins. If there are no HIV proteins, there is no independent entity called HIV. Period. The Perth group wrote about this, And even Gelderblum's paper doesn't admit that that's true. He said, well, I don't know what he said. They just talk nonsense to get around it. Montagnier knew that. So for him not to ever go public with, yeah, we were wrong, this is all nonsense, there's no HIV, puts everything after that into doubt. And I would say, you know, the whole work that he does is sloppy and anti-scientific, and he uses the same indirect measurements. So it's not to be believed. You would have to go and look at the methods section and see what he actually did, because he is a suspect character from the get-go.
I want to thank my sponsor, Lightwater Scientific, who helped me deliver free, valuable information to you and also allow me to have great guests on this channel. Lightwater Scientific produce the purest and most deuterium-depleted water in the world. Depleting or lowering your deuterium has numerous health benefits, from better metabolic health, more energy, greater resilience, less brain fog, increased physical performance, enhanced healing, and healthier mitochondria. Deuterium is an isotope of hydrogen, also known as heavy water, because it's bigger and heavier than regular hydrogen. Even though deuterium makes up only 0.02% of hydrogen, it's found everywhere. Deuterium is a burden to your body because it interferes with the intricate chemical reactions that occur by slowing them down. Deuterium is kryptonite to your mitochondria, and we need healthy mitochondria to produce energy. There's over 60 years of scientific research on the negative effects of too much deuterium on health, and also the positive benefits of lowering deuterium in the body. Lightwater deuterium-depleted water is 100% safe and non-toxic. In fact, it's the closest in structure to the metabolic water that your mitochondria produce. Lightwater deuterium-depleted water comes in 5 or 10 parts per million glass or plastic bottles. So level up your health by leveling down your deuterium today. The purchase link is in the show notes, and use code Dr. Sarah for a discount off your order. The only issue with this is when people actually have we were talking about artifacts and the phage before, so I was just going to add to that. When I worked with phage lander, you actually clone it and you put your own DNA you want to put into the bacteria. So you're already going to say all the phage landers that we ever made in the lab weren't even real anyway, because humans made them, yet it's still classified as a living thing or a virus. So it's back to this idea of people will say, okay, that's a bit too technical for me, but I know somebody who died of so-called HIV or had a so-called virus. And it's back to this thing about how do the same symptoms appear? It's like the electron microscopy. It's a consistent thing that appears all the way through electron microscopy all over the world. So how do symptoms that correlate with something that would appear doesn't exist, how does that happen?
So in order to actually attempt to be scientific or logical or rational, we have to understand what the claim is. They say, number one, there was a new disease, a specific disease that has these particular symptoms, and the cause of that disease is an infection with the virus. That's the claim. So the first problem is nobody can define or prove that it was a new disease. Kaposi sarcoma, wasting have been happening for eons in all kinds of situations, particularly with so-called immune suppressive drugs, right? In other words, you poison the crap out of somebody who's getting a kidney transplant, and they develop Kaposi sarcoma and wasting, etc. So it wasn't a new disease. And you can easily understand that because in Africa, anybody who had a thrush, a yeast infection, and lost weight was told that they had AIDS, right? So every country has a different definition, and that means it's not a real biological entity. It was and that's the way they do it when they want to have a new disease or roll out a new virus and a new vaccine or a new treatment. They take a bunch of different symptoms, weight loss, yeast in your mouth, lesions, etc., and they clump those into one disease. They did that with polio too. Then when they roll out the vaccine, then they change the definition of the disease. So miraculously, everybody gets better. Nobody has the disease anymore because they had the vaccine. With polio, in order to be diagnosed with polio in the beginning, you had to just be have an acute illness and then paralysis or weakness for a day or two. And then after the vaccine, you had to have weakness or paralysis for 6 months. So 98% or so of the people recovered in 6 months, and so they didn't have polio. And that's because they changed the diagnosis and they said, I see the vaccine worked. So nobody's saying that there aren't sick people, right? And nobody's saying that these sick people don't often have similar symptoms because they do similar things, like take an extraordinarily high amount of antibiotics and poppers and have, 20 sexual partners per week for months. I mean, I don't think I would survive that for a month. And socially ostracized, emotional, troubles up the wazoo, all kinds of recreational drugs, and didn't eat, etc., lots of other things. And then they get sick. Now, if you're a rational person, you would say this isn't a new disease, that's for sure. This isn't one disease. And what is the evidence that this syndrome, this collection of symptoms, is actually caused by a virus? And I can tell you there is not one shred of evidence that that's the case. Nobody has ever isolated the virus. They've proven there's no HIV proteins, just like I said. Nobody has ever convincingly purified it or taken an electron microscope picture or purified it and shown that this genetic material actually came from that particle and not from the T lymphocyte or something else in the person. And because they never had the particle, they certainly never exposed a person to the particle in a normal way and shown they got sick. And by the way, if anybody out there listening thinks I'm wrong, you're going to have to send me a study that shows me that I'm wrong. If you say, well, my doctor said, or how do you explain that people get sick or whatever, that's nonsense. You have to show me the evidence that this is the case, and I happen to know there is no such evidence. And that gets into the next point, which is there has never been a virology experiment. Any more than there has ever been an experiment of what are the effects of exploding unicorns. Because in order to study the effect of exploding unicorns, you have to have the unicorn first and then show that it explodes. And you have to prove there is such a thing as a unicorn and then show what it's made of and that it explodes and breaks down buildings. If you claim that that's the case, you better be able to prove that that thing exists. And there is no proof, no evidence that the virus exists. And so how can they do an experiment with it? The proof is they take unpurified snot and put it on a cell culture. And if the cell culture breaks down, that is called the proof of the existence of the virus. That's called the isolation of the virus. I mean, and we've proven that the culture breaks down without any sample from anybody in the culture. You just starve it and poison it like they do always, and it breaks down. It's been proven at least 10 times in the medical literature. So that claim that this thing has been shown to exist and isolated so it can be studied is falsified. Period.
Yes, that's fair enough. And in case people don't know, I'm looking for a virologist to have a conversation with Dr. Cowan about this because, like you've said, just to loop back to polio, have you read the book The Moth and the Iron Lung? Because I found that really
Yeah.
interesting about the correlation between covering produce with lead and arsenic and then treating people with heavy metals who so-called had polio and then added DDT to the mix. And I found that a very interesting story because it's like with humans, if you say to somebody there isn't something, we always want to know, well, what happened really.
Right. But that's because we are trained to think irrationally. And if there, again, I keep saying this every podcast, every interview. If you want to get somewhere with in in life that's closer to reality, stick with investigating claims and finding out they're not true. And don't immediately run to, well, it must be DDT, it must be lead arsenic. Now, you can, once you debunk the claim, there is no evidence that there is such a distinct entity called polio, number one. There is no evidence of a polio virus. Therefore, there's no evidence that a vaccine could have done anything to change, keep people from dying or change the frequency of a disease which doesn't exist and a virus which doesn't exist. Now, once you do that, and so the only way you'll reopen that case is if somebody can say, no, here's the definition of the disease, here's the virus that caused it, here's how I found it, purified it, isolated, characterized the proteins and the genetic material, here's how I showed it was contagious, etc. If they do that, you can reopen the case. They can't. So then you move on. And then you can say, okay, people are getting sick, right? That's for sure. That's an observation. Why might that be? Well, it turns out if you eat lead arsenic, you get, damage to the anterior horn cells of your nervous system, which is where the movement essentially originates from a nervous system point of view, and you get paralysis and weakness. Same with DDT. So be careful about making a claim that you've proven that those are have been shown to be the cause. But why don't we investigate that? Why don't we do real science and expose? I even hate to suggest this because I don't think there should be any animal studies anymore. It's just flat out torturing animals, period. And now that I'm an animal lover, I didn't used to be, but now that I am, I don't even want to say it, but you could expose animals to lead arsenic and see if they get paralysis.
That's
What's
why
the problem? Why is this so hard to think about? Why is it so hard for these virologists to say, here is proof we have this pure sample of the virus, right? If you want to tell me that a hammer knocks in a nail, you don't hit the nail with the toolbox unless you're a flat out idiot. Sorry to be blunt here, but that's what they do. They put snot on a cell culture and claim that's the virus. Let's be real here. Find the virus it's intracellular parasite. That's what's called a reification fallacy. You don't know anything about this particle until you find it. You don't know that flying invisible unicorns have backwards wings until you find the unicorn. And they won't do it. They will not be, quote, scientific because they know the gig is up.
Exactly. That's why I brought up the whole new aspect of physics and how if we can't get physics right, how can we possibly be right about biology? And there's a million reasons why animal studies are terrible, just the whole bad science of it to start with. So, but like you said, I think it's people want to live in an echo chamber of bullshit and they don't want to look out of the box. And they just have such blinkered thinking that I'd love to understand the psychology of this. And that's what I was going to ask you sort of about consciousness and stuff like this, about why are some people so rigid thinkers and other people are flexible thinkers? Because that's fundamentally part of the problem. Also, it's fear because they don't want to lose their jobs or lose their publications or lose their sort of status. So there's lots of reasons. But then back to this idea, how come you're a flexible thinker and a lot of other doctors aren't?
I mean, you have to ask them. I'm just you know, think about that question for a minute. So I'm saying if you want to tell me that hammers knock in nails in walls, right? Then I say to you, okay, find me a hammer, hit the nail with it, and then do everything else the same, like move your arm like this, except no hammer, and show me repeatably, here's the hammer, here's what it's made of, it knocks in the wall. And when I just go like this or think, you try to be creative. And what if it's just because I think nail go in wall, right? Well, okay, let's think that nail doesn't go in the wall. If I go like this without a hammer, it doesn't go in the wall. So I conclude that hammers, knocking nails with hammers, make the nail go in the wall. So you could say, so the question is, how come I think that? I
Because
mean,
you tested every other possible alternative of how the nail and the hammer together could put the nail into the wall, whereas everybody else, well, I shouldn't say that. A lot of other people would have just said, okay, a hammers a nail in the wall. That's the end of the story. Not try different permutations and combinations of the sort of study that you just mentioned about the hammer and the nail in the wall.
your job is to prove yourself wrong.
Yes.
There's some other reason why nails go in the wall. So is it thinking? Is it the airflow? Is it, like scaring the nail? I mean, you just start thinking it. So why do I think like that? I mean, it's another W.C. Field quote. It's not a quote, but it's paraphrase, which is you can bamboozle most of the people most of the time, and that's enough to make a good living. So, I mean, because they're trained, because of school, because the school system and the way our culture is set up is to. Here's another one, Ivan Illich. Uh, Here's the definition of school. School is the training ground for people who, if they do well in school, get the dubious privilege of being able to consume more school until they've consumed so much school that the only people left they can talk to are people who've consumed a similar amount of school. That's what you're talking about, virologists. They have consumed so much school, and the only people left they can talk to are similar consumers of school. And so they're just taught that this is the way it is. Nobody thinks, if I wanted to show that there is a virus, I'd have to find it somewhere, and then I'd have to have it as the independent variable on a cell culture if I'm saying that like only the virus. And I wouldn't accept excuses. Well, you can't separate viruses. Here's what they say. You can't separate virus from the host. Well, if that's true, then how do you know like the DNA or the RNA came from the virus and not the host? Well, we put it in the computer and the computer says, this is human and this is virus. How did the computer know if nobody has ever, you just told me that they've never separated it from the host. Like these people have a thought disorder. I actually, I keep telling people I don't believe in diseases, but there is one disease. It has a variant too. It's called a physician-acquired thought disorder. It's very contagious. Almost they all have it. And it does have a variant, which is called PhD acquired thought disorder. So they have it too. And this is a thinking problem. Now, the problem with not thinking properly is, since that's our like human faculty, right? That's what makes us human and able to work with the world. And if you give that up, you got problems, which is why we have problems. So that's a tirade,
Oh no,
but
that's
that's
fine.
the answer.
Yeah, oh no, it is because that's why I left science because you know, when you just can't do it anymore because it's just ridiculous. You know, I didn't want, that's your phrase, it's ridiculous. But then nothing made any sense and no one would answer any questions. Um,
Right.
you just get, and you just go out and find your own way. But then that's why I was asking you about sort of, you've got obviously a huge amount of experience with patients, because I loved your the heart book. I think is your best book, The Cosmic Heart, because that's a big part about your life and your journey. And I think a lot of the times you've said, okay, I did this and it didn't work on my patients, so then I just found a different paradigm, a different, let's question some more truths and lies. But for people to open their minds, how would you suggest they do it, or do you think it's uncurable, the disease of too much PhD and too much medical school and too much university and too much reading things on the internet that's not true?
I mean, incurable is a retrospective diagnosis. Like once you're dead and you still had it, then it was incurable. But no, anybody can solve this problem, and all you have to do is just, I use the word expression, hey, wait a minute. Like if you hear something that, so the way I did it, and I did this with patients, for whatever reason, I had a huge amount of trust in my instincts. And so if I heard something from a patient that I wouldn't do or didn't make sense to me, I would hone in on it. And because I trusted, not that, I knew everything or I was always right, but if a person said, I only wear polyester clothes. Now, I don't know what disease they have or what symptoms they have, or I would say to myself, I don't wear polyester clothes, like ever. In fact, I started looking into it. Now I only wear like linen clothes, like organic linen. So why? I mean, so I would look into that and think that's not right. So you hear things all the time.
What do you do to make yourself happy, and what do you enjoy doing?
I sit in the garden with my cat named Pumpkin. We did it for about 15 minutes today. He threw up last night, so he wasn't feeling well. I don't know why. And so he loves to sit under the catnip plant in the garden, and we sit, and I have my bare feet, and we look at the sun and just talk about life.
Yeah, actually, my cat wasn't very well yesterday. He was eating grass for some reason, but you know, that's just how it is with cats.
Yeah.
Just before we finish, because I mentioned Wilhelm Reich at the beginning about the orgon accumulator, and this sort of ties into life force and bioelectricity and consciousness. So you can answer it however you want, but when your material body no longer's here, what do you think happens next to the sort of conscious essence of Dr. Tom Cowan?
I have no idea.
Or what do you think about bioenergy, well, as in sort of a force within us? Because we've talked sort of about water and particles and a
Yeah,
lot of.
it's all we're bioelectric beings. That's all there is. Different harmonics, different wavelengths, different frequencies, different intensities. Some are very dense and look like matter, and some are very not dense and sound look like light or sound or whatever, but that's all there is. That was the fundamental flaw in the 1850s. There is billiard balls that called matter, and that's how the world is. And it was wrong.
I suppose Rene Descartes started all that, and it's taken a long time to try and move the paradigm. But so would you say that sitting outside with your cat on the grass with the sun in nature, away from unnatural fields, is what makes you the happiest?
Yes. There's other things, eating, processing food, hanging out with my wife, going for walks. I wouldn't say I'm happiest doing my morning exercises, but I like doing. And then I have this crystal bowl that's tuned to the heart chakra, 432 hertz. So I do that. I just like, I don't really go anywhere. We
Well,
have
the
a
thing is,
huge garden, that's what we do.
that's what I was getting at about sort of, there's all of this stuff going on around us that's wrong and terrible and horrible. Yet if you can find a sort of inner happiness with nature and whatever turns you on yourself, would you say that being happy, having joy, having orgasms is one of the things that people can do to thrive in this current environment?
Absolutely. Forget about all that. And live a human life with, and I tell you, I'm a big fan. I didn't used to because I didn't know, but get yourself some animals if you can give them a proper life. And that will change the way you see everything because they keep it real.
Definitely. Thank you very much for your time. It's been
Okay.
fun talking to you.
All right, Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this thought-provoking. If you want to reach out to me for a consultation or to join my membership group, the links are in the description. Up next on the channel, I'm going to be talking about the heart, and after that, it's going to be Dr. Robert Temple talking all about plasma and a lot more.